The man you're looking at in this picture is John Sherry. He was known to everybody as Jack. Started out his high school career at Central Catholic in the middle of the Depression, and then transferred to Waite High School. At Waite, he was in what they called the commercial course of study, and he was learning things to go into a business degree in college. Typing, accounting, those kinds of classes. A few years ago, I learned that Jack Sherry took typing in my classroom. Take a look at his face. Look at those eyes, that smile, look on the face. Looks like a guy who would have been your friend. Looks like a guy who would have been fun to hang out with. After he graduated from Waite, he went across the river. There used to be, in downtown Toledo, over by where Channel 11 is today, there used to be a college called DeSales College that was a business college, training young men and women for careers in business and marketing. Sherry went over there, and just as he was getting his college degree, the war broke out. Jack Sherry leaves college, goes to the military, and is trained as an officer. Sherry gets a really unusual job in the United States Army. He is assigned to the Army Airborne, and in the Airborne, he is not going to be a guy who jumps out of planes. He's going to be a guy who flies planes. And there weren't many people in the Airborne who flew planes. Typically, the Army Air Forces flew you over and you jumped out. In Jack Sherry's case, he's in a plane smaller than your car, a little Piper Cub. It's a two-seat plane. Jack Sherry's going to fly one of those planes. And what's that little plane going to do? It's going to fly over the battlefield and look for where the enemy is. The other guy in the plane has a radio to call into the fellows working cannons, aim the cannon in this direction to take out this enemy target. He is what's called an artillery spotter, but from the air in a little bitty plane that could get ripped to shreds in a second. John Sherry is going to fly that plane. He's going to fly it in support of D-Day in June, and he's going to fly that little plane in support of the next major Allied airborne operation, something known to this day as Operation Market Garden. And today, we're going to talk about Market Garden and about John Sherry's memory and the memories of all the other Americans who were involved in Operation Market Garden. Here's the scenario. We've talked about the D-Day landings and how the landings were pretty successful, but then it was a really hard fight throughout the rest of June and July to get out of the hedgerow country. After we break out of the hedgerows, there's a couple of big battles. One at the Falaise Pocket, where a bunch of German forces get surrounded and reduced. There's other battles as we get farther towards an area of France called Lorraine. There's another invasion in the south of France called Operation Anvil. All of it means that after the day my uncle died, on July 26th of 44, after he dies at the outset of Operation Cobra, everything moves fast in France. And the question becomes, can we actually end this war by Christmas? We're moving so quickly, would it be possible to end the war in 44? Here was the scenario at that time. If you look only at the purple-held territory, excuse me, the purple-held territory is what is held by September 14th of 44, which is the beginning of what we'll call Operation Market Garden. I don't know, is this purple or blue? You guys got to help me out. I'm colorblind. It looks kind of bluish to me, I guess. So the question becomes, if you hold all this territory in France, in what direction do you go? Do you push straight into Germany down here? Do you try to go straight across Belgium into Germany right here and take that shot at Berlin after going over the Moselle and the Rhine? Or is it possible to do a hook? Okay, remember that the Germans did a hook in World War I to go down through the Netherlands and Belgium to invade France. And remember that that's kind of the fake that they throw at the beginning of World War II before the real invasion comes through here. Is it possible to do a hook up through Holland and then make a drive on Berlin? This is the goal of Market Garden. trying to make that hook. The idea was by pushing north, we would get around Hitler's set of defenses called the Siegfried Line, which was kind of his version of the Maginot Line. Could we get around the end of the Siegfried Line, surround Germany's industrial heartland, reduce their ability to fight, and make that dagger thrust at Berlin? That's the concept behind Operation Market Garden. Now, why is it called Market Garden? Well, first, because operations all have funny names. But second, Market Garden is two separate operations. Market is a set of airborne drops. It's going to be British troopers, American paratroopers, and Polish paratroopers, all working as a team, seizing critical bridges throughout the Netherlands. The biggest bridges were at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. We are attacking from this direction. This is the territory that's controlled by the Allies down here, and we want to get up here to get around the Siegfried Line that you see in dots, red dots, I think, along this border here. There are smaller bridges along the way that you need to get across different small canals and rivers throughout the Netherlands. You might ask yourself, if we have tanks, why are we worried about a road? It's because if you know anything about Holland, most of Holland is below sea level, right? This was a country mostly claimed by the sea. They build big seawalls to keep out the water and then pumps to keep the water dry. But the water is, to keep the land dry. But the land is still damp, and especially if it rains, if you try to drive tanks off-road, this is not going to go very well for you. So, the airborne's job is to seize these bridges. Okay? Why do we need the bridges? Because we got to get the other troops up through there. And the other troops are coming up from 30th Corps, and that's Operation Garden. Once all these bridges are secure, Garden launches a ground attack up this 2-lane road over the bridges to create a corridor that is 64 miles long. Okay? Now, I want you to think about this for just a minute. If you are fighting your way forward along this 64-mile corridor, it means who is on either your left or your right the whole time? The enemy. You are going to be surrounded by the enemy for 64 miles. Okay? This is a really audacious plan. It is a tricky plan. To put 64 miles in your head, imagine driving from downtown Toledo to Cedar Point and having enemy on either side of you the entire way, and then drive another 10 miles. That's how long this route is going to be that they're going to try and fight up and defend. Now, it reveals some of the problems of alliance. The whole thing does. Market Garden is the brainchild of a British general we've talked about before, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery conceived the plan, and he loved it. He believed this was his master stroke, his greatest contribution to the war yet. And in fairness, he wasn't the only one who loved it. Churchill loved it, and so did the American President Franklin Roosevelt. The person who really didn't like it was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is nominally Montgomery's equal, if not boss. Eisenhower says this: what you're proposing is this. If I give you all the supplies you want, you could go straight to Berlin. Right straight, 500 miles to Berlin? Monty, you're nuts. You can't do it. What the hell? If you try a long column like that in a single thrust, you'd have to throw off division after division to protect your flanks from attack. And again, your flanks are your sides. If you're going to make this push, you can't just keep going all the way up. You got to leave people behind to fight guys on either side of a 2-lane road. This is a really, really audacious plan. So why do it? Because what Eisenhower said is pretty much the way it works out, or doesn't work out. Why do you even try something like Market Garden? Well, number one, group work is hard. We've talked about this a million times in this class already. A lot of times it's easier to just do a project by yourself because you know what you're doing, you're responsible to yourself, you don't need to check in on other people, you just figure out what you're going to do and you do your work. And even if it means there's more work you have to do, you have a measure of control over it. Those who don't like group work look at group work and say, I don't know, I got to give up some control. I'm not going to be able to do what I want with the project. I have to rely on other people. I have to look over my shoulder and I have to look over their shoulder. And that's exactly what fighting in a coalition is like. When you have to keep the British and the Polish and the French happy, sometimes you do things you didn't want to do. And sometimes you give a little bit to keep the peace and keep your allies, the other people in your group, happy. And that's what Eisenhower's going to do here. His boss, the president, seems to like the idea. His counterpart, Montgomery, likes the idea. Montgomery's boss likes the idea. He almost has to go for it just to keep the group happy. So, it starts with the airborne jumps. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division drops at the city of Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne drops in Nijmegen, kind of the middle city. And then at the furthest bridge out from where the Allied forces are going to be coming up are two airborne units. Polish 1st Airborne Brigade and British 1st Airborne Division are going to drop near the northernmost of these bigger cities called Arnhem. Most of them are going to be dropping in daylight. If you remember back at Normandy, the troops dropped at night, right? They're dropping around midnight in order to secure targets before the ground forces come in on the boats at 6 a.m. In this case, the airborne is going to be dropping in the middle of the day, and their drops are going to be far more accurate than the drops that happened at Normandy. Remember at Normandy, people landed all over the place, scattered all about, and they did an amazing job forming themselves into ad hoc units and doing their jobs. We're not going to have that trouble here. Everybody's going to land on target. Everything is going to go really well at first, and they're going to start securing the bridges and doing what everybody thought this was going to do, and it looks like it's working at first. This picture here is from a museum at, I believe this was just outside Vagel or Eindhoven. I can't remember. But what you see here, this big part up here, is the front of a glider. And we talked about gliders back at Normandy. Gliders were those unpowered aircraft. An airplane tows a glider behind it, cuts it loose, and then that glider silently is piloted to the ground. Gliders didn't just carry guys, they carried equipment. And the front of the plane just swung up. The nose of the plane, once it was landed, you popped a couple of buttons, you flipped the front of the plane up, and you could drive a Toledo-built Willis Jeep right off the front of it. So these first drops of the paratroopers and the gliders work out pretty well. But the first hints of trouble start erupting in the north. At Arnhem, where the British and the Polish landed, they meet stiff, very well-organized resistance from the beginning. The Germans are fighting back, and the Germans are fighting back smart, and the Germans are fighting back hard, which is something we hadn't seen since back at Normandy and the hedgerows. And in this case, it's arguable that they're going to do a little better job at that. The land forces from 30th Corps that were, remember, starting down at the bottom of the road to drive the 64 miles up, the land forces make very, very little progress at first. Now, you say, why does that matter? Why do we care what the land forces are doing if the airborne are doing their job? Because the airborne can only carry what they can carry on their backs, right? The gliders are going to bring some stuff down, but the airborne can fight really effectively for a few days, but after that, they need reinforcements, they need more ammunition, they need more food, they need more weapons, they need everything, okay? And they need that reinforcement with the tanks and the armor and the vehicles that are supposed to be coming from 30th Corps up what's going to be called Hell's Highway. At the bridges, the longer the fight goes on, the worse the fight gets. Germany, over the first couple days of this battle, successfully holds a few of the bridges. They successfully retake a few bridges that had been taken by the Americans initially. They successfully blow up a few of the bridges. And the Germans blowing up the bridges is your worst case scenario. Because now that the bridge is gone, you have no way to get across that river until you build a temporary bridge, which we often called Bailey bridges. Those take a long time to put together. And what's the problem with that? It slows down 30th Corps even more. If you blow up a bridge down here, now it's going to take even longer to get to mile 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 64 up at Arnhem. It's going to be really, really difficult to have the ground forces make up that time. By the third day, you have major fights going on around the three major cities, Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. At Nijmegen, by the time we get a few days into this battle, American troops are only on one side of the bridge. And this is one of the big, we're going to be like Dr. Phil and talk about blame throwing. When the blame throwing happens after this operation, a lot of the blame is going to be thrown at the American general who only had his troops secure one side of the bridge. By only holding one side of the bridge, the Germans are really controlling the bridge. And if you can't control the bridge, but now you need to take out those German forces on the other side, you got to find a different way to do it. And in the background here, you can see an artist's depiction of how it was done. The airborne soldiers are not airborne anymore, they're seaborne. They had to take canvas boats. These were boats with like a metal frame and then canvas over it to keep it like a canvas hull, and bullets go through canvas, right? They got to use these canvas hulled boats. They have some oars. Other guys are using their rifles as oars to try and get across a really wide river, the Wall River. They're trying to use these canvas boats to get across, and it's a fiasco. They're moving slow. They're sitting ducks for the Germans who are aiming at them from the other side of the bridge. 200 Americans are killed, but in the end, the Allies do take the bridge over the river wall at Nijmegen. After that, there is a battle. There is a huge battle in the streets of Nijmegen, and much of the city is leveled in the fighting between the Americans and the Germans. I want to share with you just a minute, a video that I'm going to come back to in a little bit of how wide that river is, just to give you an appreciation.
The railroad bridge, and at 7 o'clock in the evening they captured the traffic bridge. It was 5 o'clock in the evening that they had liberated the city of Nijmegen, and when they had to go further. The last thing.
By the time we get to the 8th day of the operation, there are enormous, grievous Allied casualties up and down the route. The Polish have suffered huge losses. The British airborne in the north have suffered huge losses. Both the 82nd and 101st Airborne have suffered a lot of losses, and British 30th Corps coming up Hell's Highway is suffering grievous losses. By the 8th day, Arnhem is lost. It's obvious that the Germans have responded really competently and really quickly, and Arnhem is lost. There's no chance of getting that bridge anymore. Many of the survivors are rescued, of the British and Polish, but others are left to be captured and killed. Overall, the goals of Market Garden are not met. Did this break the German army? No. Did it get around the end of the Siegfried Wall? No. Did we do it at a low cost like Montgomery thought we were going to? No. We incurred terrible casualties. And at the end, Germany is going to punish the Dutch people for the operation. The people of the Netherlands are going to have a terrible, terrible winter after this failed operation in September of '44. And the Germans are really going to carry out some of their most brutal operations on the civilian population in the course of the entire war. In retrospect, I talked about the blame throwing. There's a lot of blame to go around regarding Operation Market Garden. So much finger pointing. Whose fault was it? So a lot of people said it's Montgomery's fault. He's the one who came up with the stupid idea. We never should have listened to him. Other people said, well, why didn't the Americans take the Nijmegen Bridge on the first day? Why wasn't, I believe it was General Gavin, able to secure both ends of the bridge? It's his fault. If he'd taken the bridge at Nijmegen, everything would have been fine. Other people say, well, what about the British generals in Arnhem? The airborne commanders of the British in Arnhem were not treating this with necessarily the most amount of intensity and caution one might expect. Is it their fault? Other people look down to the 30th Corps. Well, why didn't those guys move quicker? If those guys had moved quicker, everything would have been okay. We are going to talk much more about this on November 19th with Colonel Joe Bacino of the Army's 18th Airborne Corps, who runs 18th Corps' Twitter, and I met him online. He's a great guy, and he's going to be able to talk to you guys really, really well about Market Garden and the failure and why it failed, which when I saw him explain it on Twitter the first time, it's one of the reasons I really wanted to get him in to talk to our class, because I think it tells us a really important lesson about warfare and life. The last part of this is memory, and that's going to bring us back to the river wall. The video I showed you before, we're going to watch again, but I'm going to talk over the top of it and explain what you're really looking at that time in that dark and grainy video. Because the Dutch people have never forgotten what the Americans, the Brits, and the Polish tried to do for them to get them liberated. The sacrifice of the Americans in the Wall River crossing especially is remembered every single night. Rain, sleet, snow, wind, doesn't matter. Every night they remember the Americans crossing the wall. Let's watch that video one more time.
Captured the railroad bridge, and at 7 o'clock in the evening they captured the traffic bridge. It was 5 o'clock in the evening that they had liberated the city of Nijmegen, and when they had to go further, the last thing.
The Dutch people also remember the war with museums all up and down Hell's Highway. You, of course, recognize my fat face there, and those of you from Wait may recognize Tommy Williams next to me. In November of 2019, Tommy and I got to go on a project over to the Netherlands to commemorate Operation Market Garden, and we're standing in front of an old signpost at a museum. This was outside of Eindhoven, I think. And these museums that are kept up by the Dutch people remember what the Allies did to liberate them. Here's Tommy again. What Tommy's holding in his hand there is a medallion, a marker that was being put in the ground here at a memorial for one of the paratroopers who carried out one of the more incredible operations in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. That medallion is part of something called Liberation Route Europe, which is a walking trail that starts in England, then goes across the English Channel, which you're not walking across, to Normandy, and from Normandy to Berlin. Markers of the most important points of the Second World War and the liberation of Europe. And that's what brought Tommy and I to England, was being part of this program where students from the United States were helping to install these markers for Liberation Route Europe. Right here, you'll notice the historian that took us on this trip. He is pointing down at a hole in the ground. And this was near, I want to say this was near Best or Vagel. This hole in the ground right here is a foxhole dug by American paratroopers back during the war. It's still there out in the middle of this forest that we walked like 1.5 miles, 2 miles out in the forest so he could show us where the battle happened, and that it still scars the landscape to this day. Here's back at the bridge for the Sunset March. And the Sunset March every night is, I think, one of the most amazing memorials of all time. And it's one of the things that really motivates me to teach this class and get you guys on board with what I'm talking about. The Dutch people remember America's sacrifice and America's history better than most American people do. And we're going to spend really the rest of this course talking about understanding sacrifice and remembering sacrifice and learning from the lessons of the past in this war against fascism in the 1940s. The other way where the Dutch really remember sacrifice better than we do is at the American Cemetery in the Netherlands. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to the Battle of the Bulge and we get to the crossing of the Rhine and we talk about one really special Toledo story. This is a statue at Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten in the Netherlands. This is a statue in front of a great big column. At the bottom of that column is a great chapel for memorial. And in the fields behind there are buried thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans, some of whom, like Jack Sherry, were killed in Operation Market Garden. Jack Sherry in that little bitty Piper Cub plane got shot down and died a monstrous, horrible death. His plane crashed at low altitude, got caught in the trees, and then caught fire. And Jack Sherry and his spotter, a fellow named Williamson, both burned to death as the German troops were shooting at them, as their plane burned in a tree. Sherry's body was recovered and was buried here in Netherlands American Cemetery. That's myself and Tommy at Jack Sherry's grave. And the fellow with us is a man named Ben van der Linden. And Ben is a Dutch citizen who has adopted John Sherry's grave and visits there several times a year. And we're going to talk about Ben and the several thousand people like him who remember our boys and girls in a way that maybe we don't in the United States, and maybe we need to start doing. Let me share with you finally Tommy's eulogy of Jack Sherry. You guys are going to be delivering eulogies in a few weeks in your Fallen Hero projects. This is what a good eulogy sounds like. Folks, thanks for sticking with me. Please enjoy this eulogy and reflect on it, both for the sacrifice of Lieutenant Sherry and for the way in which Tommy does it, which I think could be a really good lesson for you guys on how you want to structure your eulogies. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Sherry was born in Ohio on August 12, 1920, to Michael and Ellen Sherry on the east side of Toledo. We went to the same school, Morrison R. Waite High School. John, known to everybody as Jack, could have had a great career in sales. His senior picture said he was an ace salesman, and that's what he later went to college for in 1938. Just months after his college graduation, Jack Sherry married his wife, Mary Ellen King, and enlisted in the United States Army. Soon after, he was selected for Officer Candidate School and graduated to be part of the 101st Airborne 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalion. In September of 1943, Lieutenant Sherry's unit sailed to Europe. They landed on October 18th and set up base near Newbury, England. After the unit participated in the disastrous Operation Tiger, they were set to land at Omaha Beach during the infamous D-Day invasions. On June 7, 1944, the unit was aboard the SS Susan B. Anthony sailing towards Omaha Beach when the ship hit a mine. While there were no injuries, the ship sank and the men had to get to shore with no weapons. When they got to combat, Lieutenant Sherry would have a strange job. In a unit of men who generally jumped out of planes, he flew one. Lieutenant Sherry flew a tiny, two-seat Piper L4 plane. In the back seat was a spotter who would observe the enemy positions and get on radio to tell the airborne artillery where to fire. In September of 1944, the unit deployed to Holland as part of Operation Market Garden. I don't have any information about what Lieutenant Sherry did in the early days of Market Garden, but in the second to last day of the operation, we know quite a bit. It was the morning of September 24th, 1944. Lieutenant Sherry was flying his spotter plane over the infamous Hell's Highway. He flew low over the trees in order to spot enemy positions when he came under fire from German small arms. The relatively delicate Piper L4 was damaged by the bullets, caught fire, and crashed outside the village of Erie. We don't know anything about when the word of his death arrived back in the East Toledo. His wife, Mary Ellen, lived with his parents on Rogers Street. They likely all received word of his death together. We do not know, or what we do know is that Lieutenant Sherry's story in many ways was buried here with him. The family didn't talk about him much. Lieutenant Sherry's nephew, Mike Wilde, said that Sherry's father died soon after. He lost his will to live after his son's death. I feel a connection with Jack Sherry. We have taken some of the same classes, walked in the same hallways, played in the same gym, and gone to assemblies in the same auditorium. But for us, that's where the similarities end. Lieutenant Sherry was an individual who had a good life to look forward to. He had a family, a loving wife, and a good education. He had the option to do whatever he wanted in life. But instead of living for himself, Jack Sherry decided to live for the freedom of me and you. He was an ace salesman, a husband, and a son. But most importantly, First Lieutenant John M. Sherry was a hero. He gave his life to help protect the one that me and you live now, and for that I will be forever grateful. Thank you.